Hello, and welcome to Speechies Talk About, the second series. I'm your host, Zoe Gilbertson, and this series will be talking about how can supervision be different? And my guest today is Kathryn Pierce. Hello.
Hi there, Zoe.
Hi. So I always start with the same question. What made you become a speech and language therapist?
Good question. Well, my mum was a teacher and basically said, don't become a teacher. And so that was one influencing factor. But I was interested in people. And my granny had a stroke when I was about 15. And my mum, we're from a sort of long line of sort of Scots-Irish, so live in Northern Ireland. And chatting and talking and telling stories, big part of my upbringing. And then my granny had this stroke, and that really impacted on her language ability and her ability to say what she wanted and express her feelings. And so that really sort of stuck with me as a teenager. But I didn't feel at that time that I wanted to choose what I was going to do for a job. I sort of chose my A levels, and then I did a communication studies degree. And I think at that time there was maybe a little bit more scope to, and I don't think my A levels would have been good enough anyway. So I did the postgraduate at City, but so it was really, it felt like such an important thing to do to support people to be able to use their voice and say what they needed to say.
Mm.
So that was kind of how I got into it, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, I did the same. I think it's really tough to choose a career straight out of A levels, isn't it? The postgraduate gives you a bit of scope to think.
Definitely, definitely.
Okay. And if you hadn't become a speech and language therapist, what do you think you would have been?
Well, I don't think this is necessarily realistic, but I'd have loved to have been a dancer. I love dancing.
Oh,
I
no.
still do some ballet now, and every time I go see a show or something, I think, oh wow, what an amazing. So maybe dancing, or maybe like something therapeutic around that, like
Yeah.
sort of a dance therapist or something. I don't know, but something very different, I think, in terms of a bit like less using my body a bit more, maybe.
Yeah. But interesting though, because I mean, dance is quite communicative, isn't it? It's like a completely different way of expressing. Um, so maybe not that far away.
Yeah, maybe not, maybe not. And we have
Okay.
to embody things a lot in our work,
Mm,
thinking about things like intensive interaction and stuff like that, kind of thinking about how you use your body and look after
yeah.
yourself psychologically as well within that is,
Mm,
it's interesting to hear from fields like dancing and
yeah.
movement and
And,
how that
a
impacts.
lot of my work is with people with quite severe communication impairments, especially language, thinking about how we communicate beyond the words is so, so important, isn't it?
Definitely, yeah.
Yeah. And what's your current area of specialism?
So so currently we might work with some quite similar clients. So I work with predominantly teenagers with fairly significant learning disabilities and autism. Um, and my main sort of piece of clinical work at the minute is these young people who are presenting with high levels of distress. So they're not able to attend, even a specialist provision. So they're having outreach education in the community. Um, so that's the sort of main piece of clinical work that I'm doing at the minute. But I've worked across pediatrics, done a lot of work with like SEMH type young people. My
Mm,
specialist interest is very much around supporting overall wellness and mental health and connecting in, what all these, different communication things might mean in terms of how to support the young people in a holistic way.
yeah. Yeah. So it is quite similar. I work with adults with brain injuries, but many of whom present with behaviors of distress, and yeah,
Yeah.
trying to formulate and work with communication within that.
Yeah. Yeah. So some crossover there.
Yeah. So, one of the sort of key topics for our conversation today, and thank you for coming to me with this brilliant idea, is talking about trauma-informed supervision. So, what is trauma-informed supervision?
Yes, good question. I think the term trauma informed's been sort of bandied around a lot at the minute, and it's kind of become quite trendy in a way. It's sort of like a term that you hear a lot, and it's worth thinking about what does that actually mean? Because I
Mm,
think it's something that a lot of us will be providing, but we might not have the sort of language around it.
mm,
So uh, essentially, trauma-informed supervision is providing a safe space for therapists to be able to explore all the impacts on them within their work, so that it's not necessarily just looking at the very specific, sort of clinical questions that might be coming up, but looking at how the impact of working in the systems that the clients might be within and the systems that they work in, and how they impact on their own nervous system, basically, and how that might impact on the way they react versus respond to situations that come up at work.
hmm
Um,
So, it's thinking about not just how people behave in their response, but what their internal experience of it is.
yeah, because if we think about the sort of definition of trauma, it's not around an event that's happened, it's around what it lives inside us following an event. So, we might experience a traumatic event, but we're able to process that in a way that it's not residual in our body, and then that's not impacting on our behavior in different
Mhm.
situations. So, for example, if you had a therapist who was working in a secondary school and they were thinking, I'm really struggling with this setting, it might be useful to explore what that might be connecting within them. That there's something about that context that might be connecting with some experiences that they're still held within them.
Mhm.
Um, so it's a lot about being curious around patterns of behavior and sort of reaction
Mhm.
responses, and thinking about, and also bringing the body into the conversation a little bit. So it's like, thinking about reflecting on what might be coming up within the supervisee when they're talking and thinking about um, their experience in the secondary school, in
Mhm.
the work related. And a lot of that is around pace. So
Mhm.
we are working often at 100 miles an hour, and our bodies don't have time to process and work out they might need to.
Mhm.
So the supervision sessions is a way of slowing things down a little bit and
Mhm.
spending a little bit more time on things, so that supervisees are able to be curious about, actually, do you know what? It's something about the receptionist. It's the way they're talking to me. It's resonating with something, a difficult experience I had with a teacher or a friend, or something is connecting with that. And so then they are able to reflect and think about tools that will help them the next time, because they're consciously going into that situation going, I find that receptionist difficult. It's connecting with this experience. So what do I need in
Mhm.
my body and myself before I go into that situation?
Mm. And you've mentioned the body a couple of times. What sort of things in the body would you be expecting people to reflect on or perhaps feedback
Notice.
on? Mm.
Well, I think just as you're speaking about something, just to kind of go in and notice where things are and what they might feel like. Um, you know, it's not therapy, but it's a way of using your imagination to think about what might your experience might be. So it
Mm,
might be that you feel, oh, you sort of like, oh, my heart feels like it's maybe going a bit fast, or
mm,
my tummy feels a bit sludgy. And it's language that we're not necessarily used to using in our supervision if it's not something that we've experienced in other places. But it's creating curiosity. So it's almost
mm,
like the inquiry is more important than the answers. It's actually like you don't necessarily need to say, "Oh, I know exactly what's happening with my body." It's more like,
mm.
"Oh, is there something? Or maybe, or actually, I'm totally disconnected from it."
Yeah,
That will give you some information about that experience that you can then build on, and
mhm.
reflect.
Yeah, so sort of bringing attention to it as part.
Yeah, yeah,
Hmm. So that brings us on to sort of how do you become more trauma informed in your
yeah,
supervision?
yeah. Well, I think a lot of this is around that sort of, I'm not sure who coined the term, but the sort of consciously competent, that you spend a bit of time looking at what you know, what you don't know, and filling those gaps in different ways. And one is your own study. There's lots
Mhm.
of great um, psychotherapists, psychologists, neuroscientists out there, that do great courses. Some that I really recommend. Deb Dana's work's really good. She's done Stephen Porges' very scientific stuff into more grounded for therapists. She's a social worker.
Mm,
And Dan Siegel's work, he's um, done a lot of work around connecting lots of different modalities of science to sort of bring it round to the sort of human connection, really. So self-study is important, but I think one of the key things with the trauma-informed work is you can read and study like as much as you like. You can become an expert in anything that way, but really it's around trying to integrate it into your own practice so that you're sort of walking the walk before you talk the talk, which
yeah.
is the bit that I find, I really pull myself back to because there's always like, oh, well, if I did that course and then I should do that course and if I did that one. But actually, it's kind of coming right back down to are you actually doing your daily mindfulness practice, Kathryn? Are you actually spending time connecting with your own body and reflecting at what's going on? Are you noticing what's going on for you in your body when you're in these supervision sessions? These are though that's the work, if you like, around being fully trauma informed rather than what is often the case. I'm not saying this is often the case in speech language supervisors, but I think with the trauma informed stuff, a lot at the moment, there's a lot of tick boxing. There's a
Right.
lot of like, yes, we're trauma informed because it sort of sounds good. And I've
Yeah.
had some experience with that in work context where I've been like, I've gone in thinking, oh, this is definitely going to be, and then I've been like, actually,
Actually,
this
the
whole context
experience.
is quite traumatizing and it's
Yeah.
not reflective and there's not space and it's not allowing because it's allowing for vulnerability really, isn't it? We're,
Mm,
we're taking our guards down by going and thinking about our soft underbelly rather than staying in our heads and just kind of keeping on the
mm,
wheel and let's just talk about this and if I did this resource, if I did this course, then this
mm,
situation would resolve. And the next time you go into a secondary school and there's a scary receptionist, you're just going to be right back to where the start.
mm.
All this learning is going to be, you know, not for nothing, but it's not going to change that reactive cycle.
Yeah.
Um, so
Mm,
it's really, self-study, but also self-work, really.
yeah. And so important, isn't it? Like you say, to actually practice it. This is not just a word to throw in to make it sound like the support is there if the support's not genuinely there for that
Mhm.
kind of work.
Yeah, because it's all about connection. And so if your supervisor is not connected to themselves, someone like me who is very sensitive to where someone is in their nervous system, I'll pick that up and I will not feel safe with that person if
Yeah.
they're distracted. They're not connected to who they are and where they are. That makes me feel unsafe.
Mm, yeah. And so, how do you think people will know when they are actually trauma-informed supervisor rather than someone who's just read about it?
Well, I think they'd know by that having their own supervision, supervision for supervision.
Yeah.
Because again, it's the inquiry rather than the end point. So if
Hmm.
you're reflecting on these things, then you probably are. Do you know
Yeah.
what I mean? Because if you
Yeah.
are investigating whether you are a trauma-informed supervisor, then it's likely that you are because you're connected to what you know, what you don't know, your feelings.
Mm.
So I think you know that way, really, through your own inquiry.
Yeah. And what are the risks of receiving supervision that's not trauma informed?
Well, I've certainly had some of this. I've had some brilliant supervision. I've had some less good supervision in my time.
Mm.
And what it can be is, you know, re-traumatizing sounds a little extreme, but it's can be quite shaming. So
Mm.
something that you have a pattern of difficulty. So I'm dyslexic, for example, and I was diagnosed when I was 19. So I've got lots of patterns around shame of not being good enough in certain situations,
Mhm.
and also sensitive to people's responses to that and what they think I can and cannot do.
Mhm.
Um, so people who are not reflecting on that whole person, looking at the intersectionality that they have,
Mhm.
the context that they're in terms of their life and all those things. Actually, you can be rather than creating support and safety and growth, you're actually knocking someone back, and creating issues that weren't there before they had the session. You're sort of um, creating more problems essentially.
Yeah. I think, that really speaks to a lot of what people were talking about in the first series, the good, the bad, and the ugly of supervision, is there were some supervisory relationships that really knocked people back, and others that were so much more about growth and change and, develop people's passion for being better at supervision and looking forward to supervision. That's the other
Yeah.
thing, isn't it? That it is that safe space. Um,
And I think it's something about the power dynamic as well, because, there is a certain power dynamic between supervisor and supervisee.
yeah.
And if you're not reflecting and addressing that, it can feel quite abusive situation, where someone is using power in a way to not be supportive of someone that's in a more vulnerable position.
Mhm.
Um, yeah.
I think that leads us quite neatly on, really, to that question of what is it in our systems at the moment, in workplaces that hinder or support more trauma-informed supervision?
Mm. So I should have said actually at the beginning that I am an independent speech and language therapist now. Although
Mm.
the commissions that I do is I work within social care and education.
Mm.
So I'm still connected to some systems, but I am very much a satellite outside of that. But I did work for the NHS for a long time and also in local authority and schools and those sorts of settings. And I think that one of the challenges really is that a lot of the systems are made for us to kind of keep going really fast and not reflecting and thinking.
Mm.
And that if you start to slow down a little bit and spend a bit of more time reflecting on the impact of the system on the staff, for example, working in a school, if you're reflecting on actually the fact that the staff don't have supervision or the school staff don't have space and time, um, it can create some difficult dynamics, in terms of like you might become like a scapegoat or sort of attacked. So it's really important that you're supported in the way you are. If you are going to be going in and saying things that are against the grain, against what the sort of normal expectations are. Um, and certainly pace is, I've mentioned it a few times, but it feels like quite an important one because when you're running the same pace, if you meet people at where they're at, it's harder for you to stay within yourself and safe and not traumatized by the system and connected to all the kind of issues that might be coming up.
Mm.
Um, when
Yeah.
I worked in Hackney, I worked with an art therapist, and that was in special schools context, and he really got me to reflect on the kind of unconscious at work and what may or may not be happening within different systems, within different schools. And for scapegoating might be one of them, for example, and that's something that can be I think speech and language therapists are quite vulnerable too because we're like have similarities but difference between staff. So it can be, for example, in a school, there can be a lot of feelings of sort of jealousy around your flexibility of your timetable, this, that, and the other. And then it
Hmm.
can end up that the speech therapist is getting blamed for sort of X, Y, Z because there's sort of these negative feelings being brought up.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah, it's interesting that you talk about sort of meeting people at the pace they are or not, because when we're talking about the clients that we work with, we're often trying to model the pace we want to bring them to, not meeting them where they're at, but maybe not translating that into our supervisory setting.
yeah, that can be the case. I think you're
You know,
right.
yeah, we're so reflective on it in our practice with clients. It makes perfect sense that we should be bringing this into our supervisory time as well. Um, yeah. And perhaps, you spoke of the power dynamic as well. In some settings, our line managers are by default, in a lot of NHS settings, a lot of school settings, it's line managers who are also the supervisor,
Mm.
um, can still be a very safe and supportive relationship, but it can create a power imbalance, or as you point out, if you're bringing up something goes a little bit against the grain or can be seen as difficult within the system as it is, it perhaps creates a difficulty there in being truly in what the supervisee is feeling rather than what the service
Yes,
thinking or
yes,
needing.
definitely. And I know that a lot of people recommend that you don't have your manager as your supervisor, but obviously we recognize that that's not always entirely possible. But ideally, there would be access to something external there
Mm,
because not only can we've got the power dynamic, but when someone's in a system, it's harder for them to reflect and see it from a
mhm.
way that when someone external is in, they can see what may or may not be happening. So it's not necessarily sort of someone abusing power or kind of
No.
using information that they've said in supervision and those sort of really dangerous things. But it's more that can they see it when they're in it? And it might
Yeah.
work for them. They
Mm,
might be at the top of that level. Actually, this system really works for me because I'm here, and like
yeah.
so it's harder to reflect, I think, on all the dynamics of what might be going on when you're very in it.
Yeah.
Um, so I
Yeah.
would really, urge people to try and find ways that they can have some supervision outside of that dynamic, even if it's sort of like group, sort of group, peer,
Mm,
it doesn't
yeah.
need to be necessarily something that you are sort of paying for, but just a reflective space that you're going to be
Mm,
able to um, just get a little bit more room for some of the stuff that when it's your line manager, you wouldn't be able to do.
mm. And I think I have to say my experience has been with speech therapists whenever I've reached out because they've, got a specialism or an area of interest, and I've reached out for a bit of advice, and looking for that slightly different perspective. They've always been very generous, um, with their thoughts and ideas. So I think as a profession, uh, we're quite lucky in that way.
Yeah, definitely. And it can be mutually beneficial, can't it? If there's a
Yeah.
small group of you to
Yeah.
meet. Yeah.
Yeah. Like you say, that it's different to your core supervisory relationship, but still a great way to add on to what's there if you are in a managerial and clinical supervision mix. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, so my last question really is if someone is out there looking for a new supervisory
Mhm.
relationship, what advice would you give them?
Yeah. I mean, I think the key thing for me really was, and I think a lot of supervisors offer this, is to kind of have a little conversation with the potential supervisor.
Mm,
Obviously, if you're looking, like on the In Tandem website, for example, people have a little blurb. So there might be sort of flashes up of like similar clinical areas. Um, but really, it's around the relationship, isn't it? And sort of how you connect with that person.
mm,
So, I would recommend that you do a few little meetings with people and just sort of check in just to see how it is. I know I offer that with new supervisors, and I always say, don't tell me now, like
yeah.
go away, and then we'll work, because
Yeah.
because people have that need to please sometimes, and they'll be like, oh no, definitely, I am gonna like let. So it's just like, I think the relationship is so important. It's,
Yeah.
that is the work. Um, when reflecting on the topic here around being trauma informed, in many ways, you can do a lot of this development work, with someone that doesn't have your clinical areas, as their sort of special interest.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, well, it's been so interesting. Thank you so much for coming
Thank you,
to talk
Zoe.
with us today. I've been your host, Zoe Gilbertson. This is Speechies Talk About. And if you are looking for a supervisor, you can see a list, a supervisor register on the intandem.co.uk website. You can also find the rest of the podcast episodes on supervision there too. Thank you.